Hello and welcome again. We broke off discussing the reasons for the persistent failure of tyrants and despots to establish a global dictatorship. It's time to inspect some of the reasons why this has been a constant thread running through the fabric of human history. One already mentioned is the persistent failure of most people to speak out against nascent tyranny when first perceived. This enables those seeking to unlawfully control and exploit others to make initial gains without meaningful resistance. Some people reap benefits from their roles in this early activity, so their resistance rarely arises, and they are taken out of the equation, reducing the overall potential of opposition. Others sense that they aren't seriously threatened at first, so decide not to rock the boat, as the saying goes. Many others, drawing on a lifetime of being cowed by bullies of all types at home, school or workplaces, never ever speak out when their inalienable rights, many of which they never fully appreciate, are abused or curtailed, fearing reprisals of various kinds. Thus, the plans and designs of the despot often proceed virtually unimpeded until it becomes obvious to almost all in the community that individual control over their lives has been virtually or entirely lost. So pervasive in human history is this pattern that many philosophers and political ideologists simply ascribe it as a basic tenet of human nature. Yet despite that view, it still remains as fact that no one has established a global tyranny, which the last talk ascribed to the fact that attempting to do so was in breach of natural or moral law. That law recognises that rights apply only to individuals, not groups, and trying to subdue and crush all individuals into one group requires more resources than any one enterprise can amass or control. Nevertheless, the attempts persist. So, what is the mechanism which facilitates this pattern? It's clearly a philosophical question which divides people along politically ideological lines. People have been conditioned over the past couple of centuries to accept political division along lines defined by the terms left and right. These terms originated from the division of the seating of MPs in the French National Assembly following their revolution between 1789 and 1799. Those favouring a greater government intervention in individual affairs, supporters of the revolution, sat to the left of what in the English and Australian parliaments is called the Speaker, while those promoting less government intervention, often referred to by the French term laissez-faire or less interference, sat to the right of the Speaker. A point overlooked by virtually everyone in modern political discussion is that while these groups may ostensibly oppose each other, they both nonetheless sit under the accepted authority of Parliament, a body elected by voting or adult suffrage. Virtually nobody argues for any other form of government, despite the fact that there are serious flaws in this system. What are some of these flaws? Just to list a few, which we would discuss perhaps in other talks. 1. The corrupting influence of party discipline, whereby MPs obey the instructions of their party apparatus rather than those of their constituents. 2. The fact that election results are often very close, meaning that just over half of the voting population gets to boss the large minority as to economic policies to be followed. 3. The fact that the Parliament even has authority to make economic policy, which necessitates the trespassing on the property of subjects at widely varying rates of confiscation, negating any concept of equality before the law. 4. The fact that this system empowers people or groups with large financial resources to lobby MPs, code for buying personally favourable legislation. 5. The inherent risk to personal freedom should both or all political parties align their policies, giving no alternative platform to voters. There are others, but anyone who thinks that those alone aren't enough to cause a serious reassessment of how our political system operates might do well to engage in some very serious rethinking. This current state of affairs stems largely from the outcome of a momentous debate about the best form of governance, spearheaded in the English-speaking world by Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704. The two had serious differences, but did agree on some points. Both began their theories by referring to man in the natural state before there was any government. Hobbes had the more pessimistic view that people were naturally at war with everyone else for resources and power, and that without some form of control, their lives were likely to be, in probably his most famous quote, "No art, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." End quote. He favoured as a form of government a strong absolutist monarchy, which he believed was the only way of exerting enough control over individuals to ensure any lasting peace. Locke, conversely, had a more optimistic view of human nature, which he characterised as basically a state of peace, goodwill, and mutual assistance. He claimed that in nature, man possessed the rights to life, liberty, and property, which could neither be granted nor removed by human agency. He proposed a constitutionalist form of government, with the law administered by consent, which could lawfully be withdrawn if the government became abusive or tyrannical. It's clear from these two admittedly short summaries that Locke's ideas basically won the day, since absolute monarchism was eventually removed from any civil society, and his theories very heavily influenced the creation of the United States Constitution. The society thus created became the most prosperous and powerful in history, but flaws in that constitution led to the influence of vast fortunes being able to buy the government and establish the fraudulent and corrupt system we see there today. Neither can we say with certainty that Hobbes was entirely wrong, as this description, written by Charles Dickens, of a public hanging of a husband and wife in London in 1849 might cause us to reflect. Quote, "The horrors of the gibbet and of the crime which brought the wretched murderers to it faded in my mind before the atrocious bearing, looks, and language of the assembled spectators. When I came upon the scene at midnight, the shrillness of the cries and howls that were raised from time to time, denoting that they came from a concourse of boys and girls already assembled in the best places, made my blood run cold. When the day dawned, thieves, low prostitutes, ruffians, and vagabonds of every kind flocked onto the ground, with every variety of offensive and foul behaviour, fightings, faintings, whistlings, imitations of punch, brutal jokes, tumultuous demonstrations of indecent delight, when swooning women were dragged out of the crowd by the police with their dresses disordered, gave a new zest to the general entertainment. When the sun rose brightly, as it did, it gilded thousands upon thousands of upturned faces, so inexpressibly odious in their brutal mirth or callousness, that a man had cause to feel ashamed of the shape he wore, and to shrink from himself as fashioned in the image of the devil. When the two miserable creatures who attracted all this ghastly sight about them were turned quivering into the air, there was no more emotion, no more pity, no more thought that two immortal souls had gone to judgment, no more restraint in any of the previous obscenities than if the name of Christ had never been heard in this world, and there were no belief among men but that they perished like the beasts." End quote. What a writer he was. Both Hobbes and Locke believed, as does virtually everyone today, that government is necessary to regulate the worst excesses to which human beings can fall. Yet, as we've already seen in previous talks, it is not the bulk of humanity that is given to lust for power. Most prefer to live peacefully, enjoying such creature comforts as fulfill our basic needs, perhaps with a few luxuries or treats thrown in occasionally, and harmonious and loving relationships with those closest to us. The problems arise and become deadly threats when those with such lust do seize control of the levers of government, and in the misplaced concerns of Hobbes compete with each other to consume the resources, even the persons of other men and women. When we look more closely, it is not the contest between left and right which can ever solve these inbuilt problems of governance. The real dichotomy is between those who subscribe to either the concept of individual rights or those of collectivism. Adult suffrage cannot solve our intractable problems regarding government. The process itself installs a practical dictatorship, which, as its errors create increasingly more unstable gyrations in public policy, progresses inevitably to a perception of the need for ever more stringent measures. Eventually, the result is either an outright dictatorship by some form of coup, or a complete breakdown in orderly society and some form of revolutionary upheaval. The loss of individual rights is the first and most numerous casualty of such political turbulence. Both Locke and Hobbes lacked a complete answer to the inherent problems of governance, although Locke was demonstrably closer to the mark. Having said that, it was a monarch who insisted on absolutism who provoked the arrival of Magna Carta, though it's surely a risky mechanism on which to gamble the evolution of a viable, just government. Not only that, but Locke may not have understood the full implications of Magna Carta, with its system of trial by jury and annulment by jury. That is the system of true democracy, where the people judge the just application of the law every time a case is tried for anything. It's possible that that lack of understanding was due to the slow application of Magna Carta's principles to every Crown subject, as well as the early removal of trial by jury involving the common folk. Initially, no doubt, it was the barons who were seeking freedom from oppression primarily for themselves. And it took a long time for the realization to dawn that those individual liberties applied to everyone, not just the aristocracy or the landed gentry. Indeed, there are too many altogether who fail to grasp that fact and principle even now. In summary, then, the real choice facing people is either to support wholeheartedly the concept of individual rights as embodied in Magna Carta, especially Articles 39, 40 and 61, striving with whatever power we can muster as instructed to restore true individual liberty and place control of the government in the people's hands via trial by jury. Or we can remain on the side of the collectivists, those who wish to maintain the current mode of dictatorship by lumping everyone in together under the banner of so-called parliamentary democracy, ignoring the facts that render that system ultimately doomed to failure because of its inbuilt flaws. There are vitally important principles at stake here, which the population is tending to ignore en masse. But ignoring principles of morality threatens at least as disastrous a result upon a whole population as it can on an individual. The question for every individual therefore becomes, do I live according to my own conscience and principles of morality, come what may, or do I abdicate my responsibility and just run with the herd, even though that may be into the looming abyss? Next time we'll be discussing that question as it applies to those who would laughingly have us believe them to be constables. Thank you for watching.